Welcome to episode 13 of the Cashflow Connections podcast. The topic for today is senior housing. That's right, we're finally going to cover it. We have a great guest today, and we're going to take advantage of this opportunity by diving into the details as quickly as possible. This asset class has been getting a ton of attention from investors for the last 10 years or so, but it's hard to know when it's kind of hype and when you're kind of getting the accurate, good information. So today, we're going to talk about demographics. We're going to talk about the hottest markets for the asset class. We're going to talk about some of the key differences between the three major groups of senior housing, which are typically independent living, assisted living, and memory care, and where the value is as an investor. Which one of these do you want to focus on? Is the value in development? Is the value in value add? Is it in stabilized? We have a really interesting conversation. It's very detail oriented. We're also going to talk about the discussion between private pay versus government pay, which in the industry there's quite a debate as far as where you want that kind of payment to be coming from. Now, before we get into the episode, just want to send a reminder out that if you haven't gone to the website cashflowconnections.com and created an account, you are missing out. We have a lot of really exciting investment opportunities coming up. And for those of you who don't know, we are a business that helps accredited investors invest in commercial real estate through passive real estate syndications. This is by far my most preferred investment vehicle because it allows you to defer to other people's expertise, leverage their expertise with your capital. You can sit at home and, make lucrative returns for yourself by diversifying your portfolio appropriately. So if you're an accredited investor, make sure to go to cashflowconnections.com so we can help you further diversify. Now let's get straight to the episode. How's it going, everyone? Today, our guest is Doug Fullaway, who's the founder of FourteenPlus, which is a company that helps individuals and families invest in senior living facilities. Prior to founding FourteenPlus, Doug worked at Vigilan, which is the leading supplier of operational software for assisted living. He started buying senior living communities in 2007 and currently owns several communities. Today, his company FourteenPlus helps the best senior living operators raise equity to drive their growth. He sits on the board for the Veterans Center of Oregon and on the advisory board of the University of Wisconsin Healthcare Administration program. He also has an MBA from the Harvard Business School. Doug is also the author of Investing in Senior Living, which will be linked to in the show notes page. So glad you're here today, Doug Fullaway. Really appreciate you coming on the program.
I look forward to the conversation.
So this is definitely a hot topic of conversation. It has been for quite some time. We've been hearing the same thing about assisted living or senior living over and over again. It always starts with the demographics. So let's talk about why this has been such an important topic and why this is the first thing that people say when they talk about senior living, and what is the current state of the demographic issues and what are some of these implications? And also, and I know I'm just jumping right into it, but are there some misconceptions people have about those impending demographic shifts as it relates to senior housing?
Certainly, it's one of those situations for an investor where we definitely have a strong tailwind here. There are currently about 20 million people in the United States who are over 75 years of age. And by 2020, that number will be just over 23 million. So in a 5-year period, it's going to grow by 3 million. The interesting thing is over the following 5 years, it's going to grow an additional 10 million. So it's going to go from 20 million today. In 2030, it will be 35 million people who are over 75. So, it's growing very rapidly. And that's what creates this excitement is, oh my goodness, we have to serve these people. But let's dig in a little bit because there are some misconceptions and some things that could mislead people in terms of what they want to do. The first thing I would point out is, people think, oh, it's the boomers. That's what's causing this growth. Well, not really. The boomers aren't really going to move into these properties until, the late 2020s. This is driven largely by those 85 and older. It's a small number today, but it's going to grow very nicely. And so if we look at this and dig in a little deeper, this growth between 2015 and 2020 is 3 million, but 2 million of that is in the age group 75 to 79, and that's the boomers. And the average resident who's thinking about moving into one of these communities is actually 82 years old. So, the boomers are not yet really impacting the senior living market. They certainly will toward the end of this period, but they're not yet. So that's the first misconception. And the other thing that people don't understand is, we talk about there's going to be a 3 million increase in the population over 75. But what percent of those actually move into some kind of community? Most people in the industry would agree it's between 8 and 10%. So, said a different way, 92% of seniors will stay at home. They'll never move into any kind of community. So what this translates to is today we need to build about 50,000 new units each year. And in the year 2020, that will increase to 80,000 new units a year. A typical community is around 100 units. So we're talking about 500 new buildings a year right now, going to 800 new buildings in a few years. So, it's a great market, and it's a very encouraging one in terms of its growth. But the misconception people have is it's driven by the boomers. Well, not yet. It's certainly not yet, but it will be. And I think it also points to the biggest increase in the near term is really in those who are younger, 75 to 79, and they don't want to move into assisted living. They are more interested in moving into independent living.
Got it. Okay, cool. And that's actually an important distinction. So before we jump into kind of the details of each one of these, let's talk from a big picture perspective. What are the major types of senior housing communities out there?
So they're really, you can think in terms of three different groups. The first is independent living. In independent living, there is what you think of as an apartment, and they provide meals. And they may only provide one meal, and that's it. They don't provide any other kind of care. Think of it like a college dorm for old people. The second type is assisted living, and in this case, they need assistance with what are called activities of daily living. I need help with my bathing. I need help with my medications. The average senior has 7 prescriptions, and they forget to take things, or they don't take them at the right time. It's the number one reason people move into assisted living is they need help with their medications. So assisted living is just like independent living, but now we have assistance with services every day, things to make, and we also have activities that go along with that to make life interesting. The next group is really memory care, and those are people who need lots of supervision and lots of help because if you ask them at 1 p.m, did you have lunch? They don't remember if they have lunch. So they need further help. Now, there's some variance on this. That is, if we combine on a single location independent living, assisted living, and memory care, that's referred to as a continuing care retirement community, or more recently, a life plan community. So, there are these different groups, and quite frankly, it gets very confusing state by state because they'll use different terms. And people get very creative. For example, they won't call it our memory care unit. They'll talk about our autumn program or golden program. They'll name it something other than memory care. So, my advice to those who are thinking about investing in this space is just ask lots of questions until it makes sense, because every state, you'll hear a term like RCFE, Residential Care Facility Environment. It's one kind of license. It's just a way of naming assisted living because they may have a distinction and a different kind of license. One would allow shared rooms, one wouldn't, but they're really 3 groups.
Okay, and from a cost perspective, there's obviously a vast array of difference of the services that are involved. What are the cost differences in the range from, let's say, the standard independent living facilities all the way up to memory care?
Sure. So the first thing I would say is this is kind of like, in some ways, the hotel business. And you can go to the Ritz-Carlton and pay a lot, or you can go to the Holiday Inn Express and pay less. So you need to understand that same dynamic exists in senior living. But certainly independent living, to go rent an apartment, you'll see $1,200 in some markets, and some you'll see $1,800 a month. Whereas when we go to assisted living, the median is closer to $3,500 a month because that includes the rent and the services. And memory care will be more in the $5,000 or $6,000 a month. Now, there's certainly programs and available for memory care that are $6, $7, $8,000 a month. But the range is very much driven, just like the hotel business, by the quality of the community and the quality of the services and what people are willing to pay. One thing I haven't talked about yet here that's sometimes important to understand is, skilled nursing is a very different kind of business than ones we've been talking about. Skilled nursing is really driven by one set of federal rules. There are actually more rules for skilled nursing than there are for nuclear energy plants. It's more complex to run a skilled. People don't know this. It's more complex to run a skilled nursing because the rules, there are about 2,400 pages of rules. It's very, very complicated. And it's really almost all paid for by the government, either Medicare, the biggest payer, or Medicaid, the next biggest payer, or an insurance company. That is, it's not paid by the private individual, whereas independent living, assisted living, and memory care are 92% private pay. People pay with their own money, or 5 or 6% of those will have paid with an insurance policy for long-term care that they purchased earlier in their life.
Got it. Got it. Okay. So just to be clear, because this is astounding, are you saying that because the government is involved, it gets slightly more burdensome in terms of the documents that you have to be involved in?
Well, it's not just the documents. It's not just the documents. I mean, let me give you an example of a set of rules. In an assisted living community, it's all regulated by the states. And certainly, for example, there's enough detail to say that we're concerned that the water temperature that comes out of the faucet that goes in the bathtub has to be at a certain range because seniors are more prone to burn themselves. They just don't have the sense of feel, and they literally can give themselves a serious burn. So that's one of the things that's regulated. So now in a skilled nursing community, we regulate things like exactly how much staff you must have, depending upon the cases and the type of medical services you're being provided. It's all set out in a set of formulas, and they have to be checked. And so, for example, you have to, if you notice a change of something as a nurse, you have to call the doctor when you're in a skilled nursing community. In an assisted living community, it's more like they're living there, and the person who's living in that apartment decides what medical help they need or don't need. So in a skilled nursing community, if a lady who was 92 said, "I'd really like to have a piece of chocolate," there's no way, unless there's a doctor's order that says she can have a piece of chocolate. Whereas in assisted living, if a lady who's 92 who is diabetic said, "I want a piece of chocolate," you have to give her the piece of chocolate because she's the ultimate decider of her own health care, not the facility. So it's a very different environment. One is very directed and controlled. Everything in skilled nursing is written on doctor's orders. The nurse often can't decide to change things. They have to call the doctor to get it done. So there's just a much, much higher level cost and a higher level of compliance with a complex set of rules, including you can't get paid in any way in skilled nursing unless you submit the data electronically to CMS. That's the only way you get paid. So it's a very different world. And assisted living is all about quality of the product and customer choice, and the margins are significantly different. The more services you offer, the higher margins you probably can earn. In skilled nursing, it's all about cost control because you can't set the prices. Medicare set the prices. They're completely different businesses.
Got it. Okay, I guess for the sake of the conversation, then I think that distinction is important. And as listeners at home will see, this is a very complicated asset class just within only the senior housing assisted living space. So I guess in the assisted living space or the senior housing space as a whole, where do you think the real opportunity is within those three major segments that you mentioned: assisted living, independent housing, and memory care?
So I actually think there are two very interesting, good, solid opportunities. The first is in the world of independent living. The average age of the current inventory is 15 years, and they aren't necessarily that well maintained. So, coming into the market that is undersupplied and providing a new product that has actually the highest margins of all of these types. A 45% gross margin in an independent living business is very common. So that's the first real opportunity, is in independent living. The second opportunity really is in a variety of a value add roll up kind of strategy. That is, there are currently about 66,000 senior living communities of some type in the United States. Now, let's narrow it down to assisted living that has more than 25 units in it, and we get down in the 22,000 range. Many of those were run and started years ago by a family, and they haven't had the money to keep it up to date, and they don't have the systems to run it really efficiently. So going and acquiring one that has a 25% EBITDA and spending 3 or 4 years to increase the rents, put the right computer systems in, train the staff properly, take advantage of group purchasing programs to control the costs, it's relatively easy to double the value of that property in 4 or 5 years, earning 2x on your money and a 15% internal rate of return. So I see 2 good opportunities out there.
Okay, cool. And this is something that I definitely wanted to touch on. You mentioned that the vintage of some of these buildings is slightly older, so 15 years. Like, let's say, for example, for a multifamily investor, most people are still interested in purchasing buildings that were built perhaps in 1985 or 1995. What are your thoughts on like the age difference in senior housing as opposed to something like multifamily or even self-storage, where a lot of people are willing to go back 20 years without really batting an eye or really taking note of that?
Well, I think that this market is less mature in terms of investor savvy. That is, there aren't that many people who really understand that you can go buy a 25-year-old community, and with proper upgrades and maintenance, it's a phenomenal performance asset. So there isn't a problem in doing that, and I wouldn't be afraid of doing that. However, there are lots of opportunities here that might not exist in multifamily because there, quite frankly, just aren't as many investors, and it isn't as sophisticated. So, for example, in the multifamily world, many operators, require that there be renters insurance in place. In the senior living business, that's something that's just getting started. Only the biggest providers have actually started to do that. Everybody else has been afraid of it. So there's less sophistication, meaning they haven't kept some of those older properties up to keep them producing income. And so it's actually a great opportunity, I think, for an investor to come in and realize that you can take an older asset, and fix it. I've actually made my best returns by helping acquire some older assets, not brand new things, because the cost of building a brand new assisted living unit is someplace around $185,000 a unit. And, I'm looking at a proposition now for an older building where one can acquire it for $65,000 a unit and certainly spend $30,000 or $40,000 a unit to fix that building up and make it really up to date, and really still be able to underprice the brand new building that was put up across the street. So I think this is a really great opportunity for investors in this market, the fact that there are older ones. And that's why I like the value add roll-up play in this market.
Got it. When you're looking at this asset class, you mentioned the rental rates being pretty high, let's say $3,500 up to $8,000 a month. Is median household income a real big concern of yours in terms of looking at a market and identifying something that's going to work in, given the fact that it's kind of a high cost asset class?
Yeah, certainly you want to understand some things, but I would say this: median income and the revenue / the product you're putting in the market need to match. Let me give you a couple examples. I'm a part owner in a property that has 72 units in a very small town, population 15,000 in Eastern Oregon. There's no industry in the town. It's very, very, the median income there is less than $38,000 a year. And, there was a property that wasn't performing. We acquired it. We priced it to match the market. The product matches the market, and it returns 12% cash on cash to the investor, even though we have 85% of our residents are Medicaid. Let me give you a contrasting example. I'm helping raise equity for a brand new development in Jupiter, Florida. Jupiter, Florida is, Celine Dion and Tiger Woods and, all of high income golfers in the world live there. There's a lot of money there. The median income there is $63,000 a year, which is 27% higher than the national average. And the average is $94,000. So what you see is a market that has a few people with a really lot of money, but even everybody else has got a lot of money. And so you go look at the market and say, well, does this matter? Well, there are two existing assisted living communities. One is 12 years old. The other one's 17 years old. One is run by a family. It's completely full. They're charging a very unusual $40,000 entrance to a rental model.
Wow.
And it's because there's so much demand. So in this case, this new development will be sort of Ritz-Carlton level because it's obvious this market will support it. Well, you can see the one I talked about in East Cascade, there's no way they can support a Ritz-Carlton level product. So yes, I'm very concerned about the median income matching and the product. And you got to be careful that those do match. So the things you look at are certainly median income versus the product you're going to put in. You look at the housing values themselves. If you've got very low value in the houses, that tells you that when a senior sells their house, they don't have that much money to move in. Because a big source of cash for people living in assisted living is to sell their house and take that equity and spend it. The other thing that you really want to look at is you want to look at the income of the son and daughter who live in the area. Because the higher that is, the more certain you are that the bills are going to get paid. And so those are probably the biggest three things people look at.
Okay. And with that in mind, what are some of the markets that you think are most favorable for this asset class?
So I would tell you that if we look at the geography, there's certainly some that I'd be afraid of and some that I'd be excited about. But I think the important thing is to understand when we say market, in this world, we need to look at 1 mile, 3 miles, 5 miles, and a 15-minute drive. Because in most cases, the son or daughter want to visit and they don't want to live an hour away. And mom doesn't want to be an hour away from their kids if they can help it. They want to be where they drop in several times a week. So, it's important to look at the micro market. Well, let me give you an example of one of those geographies that's, quote, a problem, Houston, Texas. Houston, Texas was sort of overbuilt. That is, they built too many units and the census for everybody in the area dropped for a while. But right in the middle of that, I was working with a company and they put up a brand new property and it was cash flow positive in 125 days. Now, the reason they could do that is they understood the micro market and they understood the lack of memory care in that micro market. And they knew there was lots of demand for that product at that price point in that 5-mile circle. And so here you have this market that's, quote, overbuilt, and yet somebody could step in the middle of it. So it's maybe a little different than some other products. Now, I would tell you that let's talk about class A, B, and C. Let's take, downtown San Francisco. Well, at first, or there's a brand new assisted living community being built in Manhattan. The projected price per month is $20,000. It's crazy. It just seems like you couldn't do this. Well, if you can own that property, if you can actually get it entitled and own it, you can be insulated from competition for years. You can charge a premium price and you can make a great return. The problem is, can you even get in? So the reality is, if we look at Class A markets for senior living, it's very difficult to get in because lots of foreign investors and large public REITs want those properties and they'll pay a premium price. $400,000 a unit is not uncommon, and so it's difficult for many investors to get into that. If you can, good for you. Go get it happen. But it's very hard. The Class B markets, if we go to a slightly smaller market, all of a sudden there are lots of opportunities, and the lenders will put their money in. When we get to C markets, there's some great opportunities, but it becomes more difficult for the major lenders because they don't understand it as well, and they're all about reducing risk. So hopefully I've answered your question in terms of please look at the micro market, and please think about, where is your funding going to come from and how are you going to compete? All those go into the mix of deciding where to put your money.
Yeah, that's definitely a very detail-oriented answer, and so I appreciate the specificity there. This is something that comes up a lot in this business, which is the private pay versus government pay debate. Some investors favor government pay because they think it's very reliable. Other people think that government pay is at the whims of, the government, so it could come and go kind of at the whims of the legislation. What are your thoughts on those two sides of that debate, and then how big of an issue is this question in this asset class?
So I would tell you that this debate has been going on among senior living operators for 25 years, and I would tell you that I'm an owner of a property that's 85% government pay. That is, it's Medicaid, but it happens to be in the state of Oregon, which is very good about the rate they pay and paying in a timely manner. That's not true of every state. So
right.
The first thing to understand is there are 50 answers here, because Medicaid is paid by the state. Now, there's great risk. I mean, everybody knows what's going on in the news about let's have block grants, or let's change the way it's paid. And there's lots of political discussion about this. And the reality is, in the state of Oregon, the number of people who found themselves on Medicaid due to the Affordable Care Act, they expected 700,000 and they got 2 million. And all of a sudden the state has a huge problem of, oh my goodness, we don't have that much money. Where are we going to get the money? So there's, in my opinion, definitely a risk. Okay. I think it's important to understand that assisted living is 92% of the residents are private pay. So at some level, maybe this, it doesn't matter. You can go find plenty that are private pay. The most common thing you see is people will say at entrance, when you come in the door, we don't want you to be on Medicaid, but if while you're here, you've been here 5 years and you run out of money, we're not going to ask you to move out. We'll accept the Medicaid. The term that's used is a spend down. And so it's important to control the number in the property. I'm also a part owner in a property that has 120 units in Tacoma, Washington, and it's private pay. We will not take Medicaid at entrance. And quite frankly, we get very nervous when we have more than 10 Medicaid residents because we're getting a fixed amount per month, and we're usually losing money on that in that building. So it's one of those things that has to be controlled and watched very carefully. Having said all that, I think there's actually going to be a change we're going to see occur over the next 5 years. We know as a country that 5% of seniors consume 50% of the Medicare payments. Think about that a minute. It's stunning. We also know that if you put medical assistants and medical practices inside of a senior living community and you coordinate it all very carefully, that you can reduce the admissions to the hospital by 80%. That is, you could save $10 billion of Medicaid payments if you would, instead of sending people home from the hospital, send them to an assisted living community to live. That doesn't mean the assisted living community is going to get that Medicare payment. The individual is going to get it. But there's a massive business opportunity here to solve a huge problem that we have in society, that is senior living, to provide the assistance and care for people when they're older that they don't get when they stay at home. So I do think there's great risk. You have to manage it. But there are people who go after the affordable senior living market. That is, they use tax credits, either 4% or 9%, who are absolutely going to take Medicaid. And as I say, the property I'm an owner in does 12% cash on cash, but this is not for amateurs, okay? This is not for neophytes. This is seriously detailed stuff to get it right. So if you're going to go there, make sure you find an operator who already knows how to do it. And look at their
Great
track record.
suggestion. Yeah,
Great.
definitely.
You definitely can do that, and you can make great money. I mean, I'm very proud of the fact that we pay a great dividend. We deliver great care in this property, and it is a very high quality product we're delivering.
Very cool. One of the questions that is typical of something like multifamily, especially, is the walkability. Is this a big piece of this asset class? I'm trying to get a feel for how much the walkability is a component, given the fact that it sounds like, especially in the assisted living and the memory care, the tenants are going to be not leaving very often. What are your thoughts on that?
So this is a really interesting question, and actually a fairly interesting debate going on amongst the CEOs in this industry. I was at a conference yesterday. This very question came up. Some said one thing, some said another. And I will tell you there's no definitive study that answers the question, but I'll give you my own experience. First, I don't think most seniors get up and go out to everything all the time. But remember that something is very important for a senior is not to feel like they've been shipped off to Siberia. Having an assisted living community that's 10 miles away from all the activity in the community isolates people, and they don't like that. They want to be part of life. They want to feel like they're still alive. So the fact that the daughter can come visit and then go across the street to Whole Foods to do her shopping is a plus for the daughter, and it helps influence the decision. I can tell you in Portland, Oregon, where the market penetration of those over 75 who live in some kind of community is 28%, not the national average around 8 or 10%. And if you look around at the communities that have the highest occupancy and the best margins, they all have what we would think of as walkability. There's a restaurant, there's a daycare center, there's a gym, there's a library, there are nice restaurants. You can go to Starbucks. Does that mean that the person in memory care is going there? No, they're not. Does that mean the senior's going there? Well, yes, some of them are. Some of them make it a habit of 4 or 5 of them get together in the morning and off they go to Starbucks together. So I would say the jury's out. We don't really know, but my intuition is if you get to choose between one that's sitting by itself, well-run, and one that's well-run that's walkable, the one that's walkable is going to have a better return. I can't prove it, but that's my intuition.
Makes sense based on the occupancy levels, is totally what you just said. So that actually brings up a good question. So in certain situations, is it really the tenants that are making that call of where they're going to end up staying, or does it have a lot to do with the younger generation that, you mentioned earlier that they may actually be the ones that are paying for this service? What are your thoughts on the role that the daughters and the sons have on picking the place and picking where it is?
Yeah, this is one of the things that's been constant for 15 years in senior living, and that is if we look at the process of how somebody ends up in an assisted living community, the daughter is the biggest influence on this decision. And let me explain why. If the daughter's nearby, they go to visit mom and realize there's a stack of bills that haven't been paid. And then on the next visit, they realize things are pretty dusty and the dishes are dirty. And, oh, by the way, mom, when's the last time you ate? Well, I really, I'm not hungry. It's okay. Or I had a good breakfast. They're not eating well. They realize the medications are sitting on the counter and haven't been taken. The bills aren't paid. And the first person who's going to do something about is not the 82-year-old mom. It's her daughter who's going to say, Mom, we need to do something. In fact, the process usually starts with the daughter shopping. She goes online first. She goes to Google. She does a search. She looks at what's nearby. She talks to her friends. She goes and visits them. And then she broaches the conversation with her mom. So I think you can see this decision is largely driven by the daughter. But at the end of the day, most good properties, most good communities will say to the daughter, look, it's really important that your mom be involved in this decision. Otherwise, she's going to resist it. She doesn't want to leave her home. She wants to stay home. Right. So people don't wake up on Saturday morning and say, gee, let's go look at assisted living communities. That's not how it works. They wake up in the hospital bed on a Thursday afternoon when the doctor says to the daughter and the mother, your mom's broken hip is such that she's not likely to recover 100% of her mobility, and it would be a good idea for you to start thinking about senior living. And that may be the first they've ever heard that conversation, and it's a shocker. It's like, oh no, my world is about to end. So the decision's largely driven by the daughter. The mother or the father need to be involved in it for it to work effectively. Yeah, there are rare occasions like my dad who called me up one day and said, well, we're moving. What do you mean? They lived in a house here in the Portland area. He said, oh, we're moving to this independent living community over here. I said, Dad, what's driving that? Well, I realized that most of your mom's friends have died. And while I go out and play golf 4 days a week, she has no social life. And when I go visit and have lunch with my buddy who lives there, boy, his wife has a great social life. And he said, one of these days I'm going to die, and I would rather have her someplace where she's got some friends and she's going to be taken care of, because I'll be happier knowing she's being cared for. That actually happens, not as much as we might like. That is, her, the daughter and the son weren't involved in that decision at all, but it's kind of the exception.
Sure. Yeah, I definitely can see that happening, and it's going to change the way that things are marketed. It's going to change the way the company's branded if they're taking into account the fact that potentially the younger generations are going to have a lot of the decision-making control.
Yes.
So there's a distinction that I want to make clear on this asset class. It's very unique. So in most passive investments that I'm familiar with, usually I use the term operator and sponsor basically interchangeably, right? So I'm a passive investor. I typically invest in a operator/sponsor that specifies in one specific asset class. But with senior housing, there is a distinction there between what it means to be an operator and what it means to be a sponsor. Can you kind of explain the distinction there and why that's different for this specific asset class?
Yeah, this is interesting you raised this, because I actually didn't understand this industry was different until I started trying to raise money, and people would say this, and I realized, oh, wait a minute, they mean different things than I think. So for example, let me talk about the small property in Eastern Oregon that I own. I was actually, quote, the sponsor, in that I went and rounded up the investors, got the money. I actually signed the loan, recourse loans I signed with my property. So I was really the sponsor. I was not the company that would manage it day to day. I actually went to a company that was out there that managed senior living communities for other people. And I hired them. So the group of owners has a contract with the management company to operate the building day to day. And we delegate them to the ability to spend money and to hire people and take all the actions needed to run the building and to report to us on a regular basis and show us the budget and talk about what they need to grow. But there's really a difference between a sponsor and a day-to-day operator in this business. And it gets more confusing because you have some companies that are, quote, owner operators. That is, they are actually the ones who own the building and they operate the building. And now we get to those owner operators who don't actually own all their own buildings. That is, maybe they own 5 of the buildings, but a large public REIT owns 12 more and they lease them back to the company to operate them. So does that sort that out for you? It's very confusing. It's very confusing.
Yeah, I mean, just for the listeners at home, essentially there's a distinction there. And operators, let's say operators can be national. These are more thought of as management companies, though sometimes they do own things as well. And sponsors are typically more one step removed from the properties, overseers. They're more in charge of the capital raising capabilities and investor communication, et cetera, as opposed to having an on-site property management team. Usually you find them integrated, but for whatever reason, probably because of the complexities of the asset class, they're separated. Makes total sense.
Yeah,
From a national basis, what are you seeing in terms of the range of the cap rates? I know we talked about San Francisco, Los Angeles, and down the tertiary markets, but what are you seeing overall in the markets that it's making sense in?
So I can tell you I have the preliminary copy of CB Richard Ellis is about to issue a report later this week Spring 2017 Senior Housing Care Investor Survey and Trends. So if you're going to be an investor in this space, call your friendly CB Richard Ellis office and ask them, because they'll give you this publication. And it's quite frankly one of the two best sources out there. So let's first talk about, they split it by independent, assisted, memory care, nursing care, and CCRC. So let's take sort of the average cap rate for a Class A independent living is at 5.6%, assisted living at 6.5%, memory care at 6.9%, nursing care at 11.4%, and a CCRC, which is sort of a weighted average of the above, at 7.4%. If we go to a Class B market, same things: independent living 6.5%, assisted living 7.3%, memory care 7.6%, nursing 12.2%, and a CCRC at 8.2%. So what we've seen is there's actually been a bit of, things have tended lower, but now they seem to have flattened. And the consensus across the people I listened to yesterday, both, lenders and CEOs of operating companies, really was they don't expect to see these things go much lower. They actually see them that they're all predicting they're going to stay flat. So when I think about assisted living in round numbers, think about 8% as the real cap rate. And then I look at the situation, and I'm a lot more concerned about the cash flow and the return on cash, as opposed to the cap rate. But at least gives us a shorthand to talk about these things that's reasonable.
Got it. What are some of the unique challenges? I'm sure there are many, many challenges. What are some of the unique ones to this specific asset class?
Well, I think it can be summarized by, this is an operating business, and for 100 residents, an assisted living community will have about 55 employees. That tells you that between 50 and 60% of variable cost, or about 30% of revenue, is labor. So, that's the first thing to understand. The first complexity comes from, where do I find the people? How do I pay them, and how do I keep them? And there's a huge pressure on the cost of labor. I mean, the state of Oregon, the city of Seattle, they've all mandated these minimum wages that, quite frankly, are higher, and they're going to cause some pretty serious problems because of that. But it's also, you can think of this as just a complex business, and you're running a hotel, you're running a medical clinic, you're running a cruise ship in terms of entertainment and activities, and you're running a restaurant all at the same time. Right. And so now you get a reason why a lot of large institutions have not understood this market and invested in it. That's the bad news, and it's complex. The good news is, if you find the right management company, the right operator who's got a track record of doing this, it produces a very solid return. People don't understand that, if you look at Preqin, you'll get a 13.5% average internal rate of return in the senior living business. If you look at a study that was done by Increef, you'll get a 14.7% internal rate of return, far exceeding the next one down at commercial. It's a great place. And there's a family office I know that I'm helping raise money for. And, you look at their 24-year track record, their average internal rate of return is 27%.
Wow.
So they understand, if you can understand the market, you can make great money by picking the right operator. And what a lot of people don't understand is, I have some people come to me and say, I want to invest. And, maybe they're not an accredited investor. And I say, well, look, let's go look at the public REITs, and let's go look at them and buy 4 of them, buy a small amount of 4 of them, hold it for 5 years. And you've got a 95% chance of making better than a 12% rate of return, and you're liquid every day of the week. So senior housing, I think, has some really interesting characteristics for those who want to understand. And, if you don't mind, I'll tell people if they really want to dig in, my book is available for free on my website at FourteenPlus.com, where I go into all this stuff in gory detail.
Yes, and we'll absolutely link to that book in the show notes page for those listeners that are interested in getting a copy of that. So I'm sure you have. First of all, how long have you been in the business? It's been since 2002 that you've been related to the business?
I stumbled into the business in 2002 and wish I'd gotten there 10 years earlier, quite frankly.
Right. And so in those years, I'm sure you have many, many, many stories, ups and downs and everything in between. Do you have any horror story that you'd be willing to share with us? Something that investors could learn from, some of your mistakes potentially?
Oh, yeah, I can tell you one that gave me agony for a year. We acquired a property in Tacoma, Washington that had been built by a church, and it was an older building, but it looked like it could be a great investment. And we hired staff and put systems in, and it started to make good money. And then one day we had a leak in the hot water system. The hot water system, much like a hotel, runs hot water circulated through pipes, and the pipes were in the ceiling between the second and third floor. And they started springing leaks, first in one apartment and then another and then another. And so we said, well, we've got a problem. We got to figure out what the problem is. We brought in a repiping company to tell us what the problem was. And they cut sections of pipe out, sent them off to the Copper Institute and said, well, the chemistry of the water and the grade of these pipes creates pinholes after about 15 years. The only way to fix it is to replace every pipe in the building at the cost of $1 million. And of course we went, oh no. Now, we didn't do that. We actually learned to cut the ceiling open. We kept an apartment empty, furnished, ready to move into. When somebody reported a leak, we'd move them to the apartment, cut the ceiling out at night, fix the pipes at night, put the plaster back up, and move them in 24 hours later.
Wow.
So
but one at a time.
One at a time. We just did it. And pretty soon we got through all of them painfully. But the lesson learned was on diligence. Add an item to your list called if copper pipes, check local phone book for repiping companies. It turns out for $50 you can send a piece of pipe and get it checked, and they'll tell you if you have this problem before you buy the property. And heaven forbid I didn't know, and I'll tell you, for a year we were scared to death we were going to just be completely upside down on this investment, and it came out okay.
Wow. So, yeah, that's really interesting. You'd be surprised how many interesting stories I hear about that. Everyone needs to add so many things to their checklist, but that's one that I've actually, never heard of that before. I mean, plumbing is always an issue, right? It's always one of the major issues, roofs and plumbings.
Right. You always have to check the plumbing, but I didn't know that if there's copper pipe, it's very inexpensive to cut out 2 feet, send it to the Copper Institute, and they'll tell you what's going on.
Interesting. Awesome. Well, Doug, I can't thank you enough. This has been incredibly informational, and you haven't touched on this asset class yet. There's so much interest in this asset class, so really glad we had you on today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
For all the listeners out there, I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I did, because that's pretty much as good as it gets. 48 minutes or so of incredibly detail-oriented answers and content. And, Doug has been kept abreast of every piece of data set that he explains. It's something that's coming right off the presses because he's incredibly tapped into the industry. So just a quick reminder, if you haven't yet set up an account with Cashflow Connections, make sure to do so. We have a lot of really exciting opportunities coming up, and I don't want you to miss it. Thanks a lot.